Hi, my name is Renee Newton, and this is my master's thesis review on the ethical dilemmas in 3D printing. This research was born out of curiosity. I was sitting studying one night and I saw an advertisement on the right side of my computer that said you can purchase Martha Stewart dishes, but not in the traditional way you would buy dishes. It said that you could download her design, customize them, and print them. And I thought, how does one print a dish? And I started Googling 3D printing, and a whole new world opened up to me. I saw all kinds of things that made me wonder about the innovation, but I also found some uncertainty. So 3D printing, or additive manufacturing, is the next technology innovation. It's been around about 30 years. But it was used for prototyping small scale so that you could then manufacture something. It's seen exponential growth recently as the customer becomes the consumer, and the individual person can buy a 3D printer or buy the designs and have someone print for you. It revolutionizes manufacturing in some people's minds, and it can also wreak a lot of havoc. In New York City this year, 12,000 people showed up for the 3D Expo on 3D printing, and that's just one of many symposiums that are happening all over the world. So this research wants to examine what are the proper, safe, legal, and ethical usages of this innovation. This non-experimental research sought to examine the use cases through data mining and a Twitter survey, no interviews, we'll talk about that in a minute, and address moral and ethical dilemmas in 4 areas. And then I began to examine a 5th area that the industry talked about as I did the research. And then to find, hopefully, potential solutions to some of the issues and to influence society and policy change. So what is 3D printing? 3D printers are a mechanical device. They read a CAD drawing, a computer-aided design, and you can scan an image in also to get that design. It translates the data and cross-sections the data, so like slicing a piece of salami, and then physically builds in layers the object that you want to build. It uses spools of plastic tubing filament also called feedstock, and it can also design from sugar, starch, chemicals, artificial sandstone, metal composites, and all kinds of other materials. Ultimately, it fuses all those layers together, and so you have a physical 3D object. You can make whatever you can imagine. So you can also manufacture things that are very customized and intricate, things that you could never do with a molding process. So people are making these intricate instruments, toys, figures, kitchen utensils, clothing, shoes, jewelry, art, and home decor. They're also building bikes and designing automobiles. They're designing food through it, and construction and architectural design. I saw a 12,000 square foot mansion, which I have a picture of later, and weapons and body parts. Yes, body parts. So they're building limbs and ears and organs, titanium spinal implants and tracheas. I recently saw an article on livers that are being worked on in China. So you begin to see the potential for good and evil. So here are my research questions that I came up with. What are the potential legal and ethical issues in 3D printing? And what standards should be set in place to ensure a balanced but proper use of the innovation and a successful future for this innovation? And what are the social and economic impacts of such a technology if we don't address the issues? The problem statement is standards must be set in place, and other measures must be taken to ensure the proper, safe, legal, and ethical use of this innovative technology that will affect a global economy and community. So epistemology is a big word for justified belief. It's what you believe in and why. And this research depends on the body of knowledge that's known as ethical theories. One of those groups of ethical theories is called normative ethics. It says in a given situation what you ought to do or what's best to do. And one of those kinds of theories is common morality. It's the idea that we all grow up in a culture or a nation or a community and we have the same beliefs based on our understanding as a group. So the basic demands of morality, such as in our nation, are the Judeo-Christian ethics that built our Constitution. Ethics are a standard of moral conduct, and then you go a step deeper when you look at worldview. Your worldview says what you believe, why, and why you believe it, and it's a matter of the heart. This researcher holds to the ethics of biblical theism. You cannot fairly judge ethics based on moral relativism, where right and wrong are not absolute. And so if you're going to just judge ethics in 3D printing, you have to have a standard. So this will depend on those standards and the business and law standards of our nation and the nations I talk about. So the literature review went into 4 areas. I saw areas that seem to cluster. And one of them is legal and intellectual property patent infringements. The second one is health and safety. So you have BPAs that leach from plastic tube. You have emissions particles from the printers, and you have issues with bacteria, for instance. Then the third one is potential security and terrorism threats. You can build guns and weapons and drugs with 3D printers, drug catalysts. There's also the economic impact. This is a $4.1 billion industry already, and it has the potential to make manufacturing faster and with less labor. And when I began to look at the education and how it's being pushed, in fact evangelized to nations, including our own, then I began to see that there's a fifth concern that the industry has, and that's how do we educate the public about this, and how do we make them aware, and how do we have recognition, celebrity recognition. So the methodology I used was non-experimental research. This gives you the ability to use descriptive data to gain insight, and you can develop grounded theory for future studies. Originally I was going to do an interview and along with my case studies, and in the end I used a Twitter survey, and again I'll talk about the interviews in a moment. This was a macro approach in deduction and inferences that I made, but it was also deep data mining in EDIC or outsider data, and I did some limited encoding based on the time frame I had. The idea was to discover and predict trends and to discover some solutions that would avoid these ethical breaches. So here are the results. Basically the results came in the form of a grid. So I laid out all of the 45 responses or ideas that I got from the literature as to solutions. And then I looked at, are these solutions coming from those that are writing it? In fact, are they writing a solution with the concern, or are they just bringing up a concern? And that's the dismissed category. And then how many of these are self-regulated, how many of them are government-regulated ideas, how many are a balance of the two, and how many are other solutions that hadn't fit into the other categories. And from this you begin to see trends. So in the legal and IP infringement solution area, everything seemed to hinge on purchasing designs online. So like Spotify or one of these things where you have to pay online for a design, that would help infringement issues. They also looked to government entities around the world, like global entities like the United Nations, and said that they should fix the counterfeiting issues that are out there, particularly in China where it's the largest problem. In the health and safety and environmental issues, the focus was on recycling and taking the waste from the printing and recycling that, and recycling an object you don't want anymore by shredding it and using it again. They talked about less transportation carbon footprint, because you wouldn't have to transfer these items across the country. They could be printed in your own area. And the use of less toxic biodegradable filament materials. There was also a nod to the need for government, but mostly they wanted to self-regulate in these areas. There's very little being done in the industry in the government because of security threats, in the area of security threats. So that's likely attributed to the fact that that's already a volatile subject in our nation and nobody really wants to touch it. There's also little activity being done in our nation and the world to get ready for the impact on the economy. And a lot of the solutions were just, well, let's wait and see, let's look at the economic trends, and maybe the redistribution of labor would be a cure. Okay, so my targeted audience then are the industry leaders, the sellers, the users, and the consumers, to make them aware of the issues. They may be aware of one or two issues, but not all the issues that are out there. And before they consider a design theft, mimicking a brand, selling danger, or broadcasting weapon designs, they'll think twice. That's the hope. They're unwitting participants. As I said a couple of times, I wanted to do some interviews, but there were no interviews granted to me at the time that this paper was due, which made for interesting study because I wrote to a well-known designer in my area in 3 different emails. There was no phone number to get to, but I asked in several ways that I was a graduate student, gave the questions ahead of time, and no response. I also wrote to one of the writers of a book and to a media expert who gave some of the issues in her work. And to this date, I have not received any writing back. So at the end, I did a Twitter survey, and I included these questions around how much self-regulation, how much government regulation, and the results were very interesting. So the inferences and future research. Some of the inferences I made based on the fact that I didn't get a response are that I'm not being taken seriously, I'm a student, nobody cares, or they already think they presented all that needs to be said by their narratives and their books and their discussions with the media. Or I may have touched a nerve, I may have even touched the tip of an iceberg. Solutions offered in the literature were often not without their own problems. No solution was perfect, and you can't solve in a vacuum. Things happen affecting one solution and causing another. So there's still gaps in viable solutions in a lot of areas. As I mentioned, there's a need for long-term testing, and there's a lot of unknowns. My audience also made fear negativity because they are looking for recognition and they don't want to alarm the public. But this seems sort of self-serving. They want, for instance, to have the government impose standards, but very small standards. They don't want government regulating them to the degree that they're not self-regulating. But they do want government funding, and so that's a little bit of a problem. Future research from this paper could mean studies in interviews where I really do get some responses, long-term surveys, some published articles or journals, just out in the media trying to get people to talk about the issues, going to symposiums and presenting the information there, and giving testimonials to Congress or the FDA or ATF about the issues. It also appeared that from the learning, from the education I've just gotten and master's degree in organizational leadership, that there were some leadership principles that applied and fit well. So if companies want to evaluate themselves and find out where their long-term success lies, they can look at some of these things. One of these evaluation tools is called PEST, and the P stands for political. So in a way, I've already done this research for them. So political could include the legal and security issues. It could also include the health issues. The economic, the E is for economic, and so we want to look at the economic impact. The social reaches to the health and safety and security issues, and it also has a social impact. And the need for recognition that the industry has also fits in this social package. And the T stands for technical, and all of these areas touch this because it's a technical innovation. But you want to look at the aspects of design and building materials and products that you're using, and that way you can evaluate your company, how well are you reaching all of these areas. The other evaluation tool is called SWOT, and it stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so you can look at what are the strengths of my company, what are the weaknesses, what are the opportunities I have to fix the weaknesses and prevent the threats. And so my example was, if you have the threat of legal actions because of air emissions, then you could look to minimize your weakness by taking the opportunity to use the strength of new biodegradable materials like potato starch and some of these other items, wood composites that are being introduced every day. My limitations were that I was limited by time when the paper was due and a lack of first-hand responses. And I could have bitten off more than I could chew. Every topic is an enormous topic, and there could be a thesis written on each of the 4, now 5 concerns by themselves. But I was trying to look at the larger picture. No one problem, like I said earlier, is in a vacuum. So the problems interface and they cross over. I also have a personal interest. You saw my world bent, my view of the world, and I'm no expert, but I do have some expertise in IT. I've been doing IT analysis work for 25 years, and I have spent 15 of those years in a research lab that did nanotechnology where they were building layers. So I have a little bit of understanding of that concept. And one of the things that I learned about in my coursework was what's called locus of control. And it's the idea that you do have control, if you believe you have control, in certain areas where you can meet vision and goals. So I believe that the leaders in this industry, if they have a vision and a goal for making things safe, can have control, can make a difference. I want to see the best outcome for consumers and for this industry. This is just one research study, and those who ponder it can take a moral stand and make a difference. In conclusion, this research sought to expose potential and legal and ethical 3D printing issues, define standards to ensure a balanced approach and success, and to expose social and economic impacts if moral issues are not addressed. And we didn't talk about that a lot, so I painted a picture at the end of what the future could look like if we don't address these issues. If you look at the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, coal became the source of propelling the industry and the energy behind it. And what they didn't anticipate was that people would get sick with black lung disease. And today, 42,000 people still work in the coal mines, and in the last decade, 14,000 of those have died. I'm sorry, 10,000 of those have died. It's a pretty big number. Now, I'm not comparing that to breathing the emissions from a 3D printer. However, 10% of antimony in polymers contains 100 times more than the safe limit that we put in food packaging polymer. And 30 million pounds of fresh plastic oil is used, petroleum oil is used to make these plastics in this industry. That equates to 1.4 million barrels by 2020. We also fought, for an example, to deregulate the internet, and that was great. We didn't want government controls, and now we face cyberbullying, identity theft, and hacking attacks. And it's a great thing. The internet can't live without it, but it also has its downfalls. So we want to look at what are the downfalls in 3D printing, and this is our opportunity. In the industry, you just can't do whatever's right in your own eyes and expect zero consequences. So 3D printing is in its beginning stages, and you have societal opportunity. You can employ safe boundaries for boundless potential. Picardi and Masick say that ethical behavior should result in more good than harm. And the biblical principle that's given for us, for leaders in this industry, is don't just look out for yourself, look out for others. Esteem others as better than yourself. And you can both succeed. Thank you.